Thank you for that very gracious introduction, both to our topic and to myself. I am very pleased to be here tonight. I'm an alumnus of the University of Toronto. I was shocked to find this new building, and I was shocked to find it so close to the Graduate Student Union Hub, which I should say I want to invoke the don't ask, don't tell policy with my experience back then. I'm very honored to be introduced by Barbara Hall. When I told my parents that I was coming here and that Barbara Hall was going to introduce me, and my dad said, "You mean the former mayor of Toronto?" And I said, "Yes." He said, I didn't vote for her. His mistake. I would like to thank the University of Toronto Religion and Public Sphere Initiative, as well as for the people of the Ontario Human Rights Commission for organizing this and for inviting me. I would like to extend a special thanks to Remy Warner for his invitation. I know this is the Multi-Faith Center, and I know he's a man of deep faith because he actually believes that two academics are going to stick to a 20-minute time limit. So, good luck, Remy. Is this going to work? That's perfect. So if things are working well, you should be looking at the Ontario Human Rights Commission policy on creed and accommodation of religious observances. And what I wanted to emphasize especially was the aim of the code at creating a climate of understanding and mutual respect for the dignity and worth of each person, so that each person feels part of the community and feels able to contribute to the community. And the two goals of the code, then, as we see, are recognition, which involves understanding and respect, and participation, which is inclusion and the ability to contribute to our society. Questions of recognition are tied to questions of identity, status, and well-being. Charles Taylor famously writes about what happens when people or an individual is not recognized, the harm that can happen to that individual. Participation is tied to questions of socioeconomic, political, and cultural inclusion, and, of course, power, especially the power to shape one's life and to contribute to the shaping of one's community. So that's the challenge, and there are barriers to that, which is to say religious intolerance and discrimination. And in my work in the multiculturalism program, it's often been difficult to convince people that, in fact, religious intolerance and discrimination present a barrier to the creation of a multicultural Canada. And as Barbara Hall mentioned today, sometimes it is difficult to convince people that they are still human rights issues. But they are long-standing human rights issues in Canada, revolving around creed. And I wish to talk a little bit about the history, very briefly about the history, very briefly about the current social context and the current challenges to creating a multicultural, participatory, and open society. So the barriers, what we're really talking about is religious intolerance and religious discrimination. Intolerance deals more with attitudes, discrimination is more with actions. Often they go together, but sometimes they do not. For example, Ontario's decision not to fund religiously based independent schools while funding Roman Catholic schools discriminates against non-Catholics. The United Nations Human Rights Commission has recognized this, but was made largely in the absence of any malice or targeting of another religion. It simply is a historical fact. The fact that these two can be linked often leads to cases of what the Ontario Human Rights Commission policy calls constructive discrimination, which I've called elsewhere, or sociologists have called elsewhere, structural or religious discrimination or religious disadvantage. So, for example, a calendar that makes a statutory holiday of Christian holy days, including Good Friday, it seems still, but not other religious holidays. There's no, it's again made in the absence of any malice, but this is part of Canada's history. And when newcomers come to Canada, they find that they're not moving to a neutral society, but they are stepping onto a moving train. It has a direction, it has a velocity, it has a destination, and it has a structure. And they find themselves suddenly in that structure. And it comes from our past, of course, and it comes from a particularly Christian past. Another example would be the forbidding of wearing of hats or headgear at work, which presents no burden to most Christians and to secular Canadians, but may to Sikhs, Muslims, Jews, etc., even if there is no desire to discriminate or insult people. Now, historically, religious discrimination has certainly been a problem, and it started with the dismissal of Aboriginal spirituality. And to say the dismissal might be sugarcoating it, the attack upon Aboriginal spirituality, the attempt to eradicate, in many cases, Aboriginal spirituality through devices such as the residential school, but certainly not limited to those. There are discriminations against non-Christian groups, Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, etc., but especially we have in Canada a long and storied history of anti-Semitism, simply because the Jewish community moved here earlier than the others, was more prominent, and there were particular theological reasons for Christians to dislike and discriminate Jews. There's the marginalization of Christian minority groups. We forget that very often religious intolerance was aimed at non-dominant Christians, Jew Boers, Hutterites, Mennonites, etc., as well as ethnic Christians. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, people worried about the strangers at our gates, this ethnic tide coming in from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe instead of Northwestern Europe. And the churches responded by saying that in order to Canadianize these foreigners, we had to Christianize them. Impervious to the fact that people coming from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe were in fact Christians, just the wrong kind of Christians, according to mainstream Canadians. There was the mistrust of new religious movements, which between the 70s and 80s here in Toronto, when I was a student. And then there is the long history of anti-Catholicism, largely forgotten in Canada, but very much part of the anti-French rhetoric, the anti-French Canadian rhetoric, I should say, but also linked to the anti-immigrant sentiment and racism against the Irish, the Italians, and the Germans. And you have to remember that until the 1940s and 50s, and even as a student when I was in the 1960s, we talked about different European ethnic groups as races, the Irish race, the French race, the Italian race, etc. Now, the solution was to pass legal protections. Here I won't speak at length about these because we have people in the room who are far more qualified to do so, including Benjamin Berger up there and Lori Beeman and probably Richard Green, who I met earlier today. But we enacted these, and that was part of a two-pronged program. The other part was secularization. Secularization was not something imposed from the outside. It was imposed by the majority. It was a project led largely by Christians who wished to solve the problem of religious intolerance and discrimination among themselves. And the first step was a movement away from a Christian Canada, even though it had become a non-denominational Christian Canada. But they wanted to step further away from that to create a putatively neutral Canadian state, which, as Jose Casanova says, must demonstrate equal access, equal distance, equal respect, or equal support to all the religions within its territory. And this involved the disestablishment of Christianity. Now, Christianity was not, in the 1960s, legally or constitutionally established. It wasn't part of the Constitution as it was in earlier parts of Canada, in earlier periods of Canada. But sociologists say that it exercised a shadow establishment or a social establishment. In other words, it influenced the law of the land very strongly by influencing the culture and values of the land. So in 1905, Canadian Parliament thought that it was perfectly reasonable to pass the Lord's Day Act and impose a Christian Day of rest upon all Canadians, simply because it was a widespread assumption that to be a good Canadian meant to be a good Christian. And to be a good Christian, one, of course, would want to respect the Lord's Day Act. So as religion was pushed out of law, pushed out of politics, pushed out of economics, pushed out of medicine, pushed out of various spheres, pushed out of the arts, pushed out of all the various spheres of activity in Canada, it became privatized. In other words, when we sociologists talk about the privatization of religion, we mean its decline as a public culture, its decline as a source of legitimation for political, economic, social, and cultural decisions at the public level. So now when people want to justify a new project, they use the secular language of a cost-benefit analysis rather than the religious language of a great crusade. So religion then is now relegated to the private sphere of personal interiority, family relations, ethnic community relations, and voluntary churches. And about this, of course, our second speaker tonight, Winnifred Sullivan, will be speaking at greater length. And in fact, I've stolen a quote from her wonderful book, The Impossibility of Religious Freedom, up on the slide, that essentially the protections we have now based on creed are the legacy of that secularization movement and the legal protections that we built around it. In other words, it's a legacy of dismantling a Christian Canada. And so consequently, these protections are mostly protect religions that are private, voluntary, individual, textual, and belief, as opposed to public religions of the old order. As Laurie Beeman observes, the more a religion looks like mainline liberal Protestantism, the more likely it is to be protected. So that's where we got to, but now we have a new social context. And the new social context is marked by the great change in immigration, which means a much greater religious diversity, as well as racial and ethnic diversity in Canada since the liberalization of the immigration laws in the late 1960s. So you have a dramatic growth in non-Christian religious communities. Statistics Canada predicts by 2017 they'll represent 10% of Canadians, although there are some problems with that prediction, but they are growing. There are consequently new connections being made between race, ethnicity, and religion, because these religious minority groups are also very frequently people of color. And so people, when you see these stories coming up in the press, very often you're confused. Is this a question of race, ethnicity, religion, or all three? And in some groups, it's actually very difficult to tell what's going on. This is happening even in Christian groups because of the new immigration has meant that some of the most active and dynamic congregations within traditional Christian denominations are in fact these ethnic churches. We're used to Anglicans being English, is right in the title. We're used to Lutherans being Germans, Korean, and Presbyterians being Scots. Of course, now when you go to any church of those denominations, you find a multicultural as well, a multicultural population. There was the recent case handed to me beautifully as a Boxing Day